This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 450, part 2, entitled Masculisting, the Divorce Courts, Lawyers and Judges. Carrying straight on. You fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges are thus indirectly responsible for the crash in the birth rate, since it is likely that if the divorce laws are not soon reformed and made menfair, then within a decade, probably over 90% of young men will reject marriage and paternity, thus wiping out whole populations within a generation. Hence, you fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges are indirect genociders. When populations become convinced that their very survival is threatened, they often go to war to stop that happening. Masculine soldiers see themselves in that light. They see you as the enemy to be killed, to stop whole populations from being wiped out. They see you as morally abominable, as vermin to be exterminated. In short, they hate you so much that they are prepared to kill you in a sex war to stop you from wiping out whole populations. I hope the above threat really scares you, because if you don't menfair the divorce courts, it's only a question of time before there are millions of masculists, and amongst them there will be many John Browns who, like the historical figure in the 1800s in the US, will be prepared to kill their manslaving enemies, that is, you. So I make a two-pronged appeal to you, which involves the carrot and the stick. The stick is the threat of you being killed by murderously hateful masculist soldiers for what you are doing to millions of men in the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts. The carrot is that it is in your own self-interest to masculist yourselves by seeing the morality in what the masculists are saying. Fluffy manslavery is a far worse gender crime against men than rape is against women, because it lasts decades. Even most monoconscious feminists agree with this if they submit themselves to the masculist chair test. In brackets, that is, a feminist sits in a chair with a masculist standing over her with a gun to her head, forcing her to choose between two options at the count of 3, or he blows her brains out. The choice is between being raped by a man or being enslaved by a man, working for him with no kids, no pay, for 3 decades. Most women, most feminists, choose to be raped, arguing that being raped is a much lesser gender crime than being enslaved for 3 decades. The masculists then turn this argument on its head, saying that that is what fluffies do to men, manslaving them for decades. Therefore women, fluffy women, oppress men far worse than vice versa. By studying masculist ideas, you will become more biconscious. That is, you will have both your feminist and your masculist consciousnesses raised. So you will lose your feminist anger at men for the ways that men gender politically oppress women, by becoming conscious how women gender politically oppress men, by manslaving them for decades, a hugely greater gender political crime. Once you become biconscious, you will be much more inclined and motivated to avoid these massive gender crimes committed against men, that is, millions of divorcing fathers, by menfairing the gender laws, especially in the divorce courts. Concretely, that takes the form of throwing out alimony, giving custody of children jointly to both parents by default, throwing out the splitting of the wealth and stuff between the divorcing husband and wife, based on the assumption that both parties in the divorce are FIPs, so that the wife is not seen as a financial parasite of the husband, but a FIP in her own right. If your biconsciousness is well developed, you may become a real female masculist and feel real hatred against the massive gender injustices committed against millions of men in the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts, and feel strongly motivated to remove them by pushing for fundamental reform of the divorce laws as suggested above. Thus, you will be motivated to reform the divorce laws, not just out of fear of being killed in a sex war by murderously hateful masculist soldiers, but out of a strong sense of injustice committed against men, millions of men, so that you readily sympathise with these masculist soldiers who are fighting for the liberation of men. Millions of men from decades of manslavery at the hands of fluffy, manslaving parasites. Now, of course, merely changing the divorce laws won't help much if millions of women remain being fluffy parasites. So the bigger masculist picture needs to be considered. That is, that women need to be pushed to FIP up. So that if women don't make the effort to study career competent majors at high school and college, then they will be severely punished by men by not getting one. I predict, given the rate at which millions of men are waking up to the considerable disadvantages of having a relationship with a fluffy, manslaving parasite, that soon nearly all young women will be powerfully motivated to FIP up or suffer tremendously by being ostracised by men, rejected utterly, both socially and sexually, spat at for being fluffy, manslaving parasites, seen as something vile and detestable, that is, hated, manslaving fluffies. It was only 9 years between the publication of Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and the start of the US Civil War, that is, in 1861. I wonder how long it will take before a sex war breaks out in the divorce courts, that is, before it is news that there has been a, in brackets, near future, spate of murders of fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges at the hands of masculist soldiers, to such a point that the journalists can no longer deny that there is an actual sex war going on. Once several dozens or hundreds of fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges have been killed, and word is out that a sex war has begun, how will things unfold after that? I can imagine that attitudes on the part of the masculist soldiers and the fluffy feminists will polarise and mutual hatreds will harden. Politicians will probably initially take the side of the fluffy feminists, since politicians of both sexes are still very much monoconscious, since they know nothing of masculist ideas yet. The next step in the sex war will probably be that certain politicians will make themselves public in taking the fluffy feminist side and then be assassinated by the masculist soldiers. This will seriously alarm the politicians, who may then call out the army to defend the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts. Probably the next step will occur in the universities as masculist ideas spread through the campuses like wildfire, as masculist groups pop up on every campus, in every high school, so that millions of young men have their masculist consciousness raised and understand the motivations of the masculist soldiers and sympathise with them. This masculist consciousness raising will divide couples, families and generations, the way the morality of the Negro slavery issue divided couples, families and generations in the US Civil War. As millions of men become masculistic, there will be tremendous moral pressure put on the politicians to menfair the gender laws, or the number of assassinations will only continue to increase, thus causing even more alarm and polarisation between the masculist soldiers and the fluffy feminists. The more intelligent, visionary and humane politicians will probably have the wisdom to see that the sex war will not go away until the gender laws are menfaired, that society needs to absorb the lessons of the masculists, that women need to FIP up, that the para needs to be legislated, that the gender laws across the board need to be menfaired, so that the wind is taken out of the sails of the masculist soldiers, so that men are prepared to be fathers again, so that young women can cease panicking at the fact that the quality young men they really want to mate with refuse to give them their sperm, forcing these young women into babylessness, which drives them crazy, since it goes deeply against their most basic nature to reproduce. There is historical precedent in the above. That is, that it may take some real political murder on the part of masculine soldiers to force the politicians to menfair the gender laws, as suggested above. The historical precedent I'm talking about was the effect that John Brown's terrorism, in brackets, who aimed to steal 100,000 rifles from a US national armory and distribute them to the Negro slaves, hoping for their insurrection against their white southern state slavers, close brackets, had on the level of fear in the southern US states that the Negro slaves might rise up and kill the white slavers. It was a mere 2 years after John Brown was hanged that the US Civil War started. Prior to Brown's terrorist act, there was rather little talk of secession on the part of the southern states from the Union, but after, 11 southern states rapidly seceded. So Brown's action had a huge effect on the causation of the US Civil War. I consider it likely that similar masculist John Browns, whose terrorist acts will have a similar outcome, that is, either cause a large-scale sex war with thousands of fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges being murdered, or that cooler heads prevail in the parliaments, resulting in the gender laws being men-faired. Masculist and MGTOW ideas are now spreading rapidly across the planet, so that within only a mere few years there will be so many masculisted men and masculisted women as well, that things will come to a head. Either the divorce courts will be purged of their monoconscious fluffy feminist bias, or there will be a sex war, and thousands of fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges will be murdered by extremely hateful and bitterly angry masculinist soldiers who argue that the financial massacring and ruining of the lives of millions of men across the world is very much a war issue, which justifies the murder of a few hundred fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges for the greater good of the liberation of millions of men from the horrors of decades-long manslavery at the hands of millions of fluffy manslaving parasites. The masculists are pushing for the FIPing of women, for the creation of a FIP Society, in which young women are socialised by parents and educated by teachers and professors to FIP up, or be severely punished by society, and especially by masculisted men, by not getting a man. Fluffies can afford to ignore the feminists who push for the FIPing of women, but are terrified of the masculists, since they cannot afford to ignore them, since a fluffy can only be a fluffy if she can get her financial claws into some gullible, stupid, ignorant, man-slavable man to parasite off for decades. So many millions of young men are now being influenced by masculists and MGTOW ideas that young fluffies are really starting to panic due to the fact that millions of young men look at them with a very cold eye and dice these young fluffies if they think these young women are future fluffy parasites of men, spitting at them for their massive immorality against men, expecting that some man will be prepared to be manslaved by her for decades of his life. Soon, nearly all men will see manslavery for what it is, that is, one of the greatest gender crimes that one can even imagine. Fluffies, in time, will be considered evil, and not only by men, masculisted men, but by society as a whole, as millions of women become female masculists, agreeing with the masculists that manslavery is indeed a moral abomination, a war issue, as something that the world definitely needs to wipe out. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 450 plus Masculist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.